We've all heard the stories of the Great War, the trenches, the gas, the millions of bodies fed into the meat grinder, a war of empires, fueled by steel, gunpowder, and money. But what about the war fought not in the mud, but in the marbled halls of power? A war of conscience, of words, of betrayal. In the summer of 1914, Germany's largest, most powerful political party held the nation's fate in its hands. The Social Democratic Party, the SPD, they were the party of the working man, sworn internationalists, brothers in arms with socialists across Europe. Their entire ideology was built on peace and the unity of the global proletariat. But on August 4th, 1914, the Kaiser asked for money, billions of marks to fund the invasion of Belgium and France. And in a moment that shattered a century of socialist doctrine, the SPD voted yes, all of them, in public. But behind the scenes, the story was different. A handful of men and women saw the abyss opening up. They knew what this vote meant. This is the story of the few who defied the machine, the ones who said no. What happens when you stand against your party, your country, and the violent tide of history? Who were they? And what was the price they paid for their dissent? The party's official policy was called Burgfrieden, or Fortress Peace. It was a political truce. All internal disputes were to be silenced for the duration of the war. You did not criticize the government. You did not question the war effort. You presented a united front to the enemy. For the SPD, a party that had been declared an enemy of the Reich by Bismarck just a few decades earlier, this was a chance to prove their patriotism, to be accepted. The party leadership, figures like Friedrich Ebert and Philipp Scheidemann, argued that this was a defensive war against Tsarist Russia, the great oppressor of Europe. They suppressed internal debate, invoked strict party discipline, and pushed the vote through. In the crucial party caucus meeting before the official Reichstag session, 96 deputies voted for the war credits. Only 14 voted against. But when the time came to stand up in public, in front of the whole world, the 14 were silenced by party discipline. One man, the party's own chairman, had to stand before the chamber and betray his own conscience. This is where the schism begins. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, drawing from deep archival work like Pierre Brouet's exhaustive 1971 account. The German Revolution, 1917 to 1923, which uses original Soviet and German records to reconstruct these events day by day, and from the meticulous party minutes detailed in Karl Schorska's foundational text, German Social Democracy. Now back to the story. The first man to break was the one forced to announce the surrender. His name was Hugo Haase. On August 4th, 1914, as the co-chairman of the SPD, he was chosen to read the party's official declaration in the Reichstag. The atmosphere in Berlin was feverish, a delirium of nationalism called the spirit of 1914. The Kaiser had declared from his palace balcony, "I know no parties anymore, only Germans." And the SPD leadership was desperate to be included in that sentiment. Inside the party caucus meeting on August 3rd, the debate was ferocious. Friedrich Ebert argued that if they voted no, Proust, the party would be banned, its property seized, its leaders arrested. He painted a terrifying picture of Cossack hordes sweeping across East Prussia, arguing that this was a war to defend Germany from Russian barbarism. But for Haase and the 13 other dissenters, including men like Georg Ledebour and the radical Karl Liebknecht, this was a betrayal. They argued the war was an imperialist adventure, that siding with the Kaiser meant siding with the very militarism they had spent their lives fighting. The vote was held, 78 to 14. The dissenters were crushed. Then came the demand for party discipline, Fraktionszwang. You vote with the majority, no matter your personal conviction. Haase, as chairman, was given an ultimatum, read the declaration in the Reichstag, or resign in disgrace. He chose what he saw as his duty to the party. Imagine the scene the next day. The Reichstag is a sea of military uniforms and stiff black suits. Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg gives a rousing speech, and the chamber erupts. Then Haase, a small, bearded man known for his meticulous legal mind, walks to the podium. His voice is flat, devoid of emotion. He reads the words that made him sick, the carefully crafted text that justified the unjustifiable. "We are faced with the iron fact of war," he recited. He spoke of the threat from Russia and concluded with the fatal line, "We do not desert our own fatherland in the hour of danger." He did his duty, but the act was a form of self-immolation. He had lent his own credibility as the credibility of the party's left wing to a decision he abhorred. The international socialist community was stunned. The French socialist leader Jean Jaurès had been assassinated just days earlier by a nationalist for his anti-war stance. Now, the German party, the largest and most respected socialist party in the world, had joined the war chorus. Haas's public compliance masked a private torment that would fuel his turn towards open rebellion. This silent, agonizing capitulation was the first casualty in the SPD's internal war, a poison that would contaminate everything that followed. One man's torment was hidden. Another's defiance would be a public spectacle. The second crack in the wall came 4 months later. On December 2nd, 1914, the Reichstag met again to approve a second round of war credits. This time, one man refused to be silenced. His name was Karl Liebknecht. Son of Wilhelm Liebknecht, one of the founders of the SPD, Karl was a firebrand lawyer from Leipzig, a man who saw compromise as corruption. He had spent his career fighting German militarism, even being imprisoned in 1907 for writing his treatise, Militarism and Anti-Militarism. In the final days of July 1914, he had been in Brussels and Paris trying to organize a coordinated international proletarian response to the war threat. He felt the SPD's vote in August as a personal and political catastrophe. He later wrote that submitting to party discipline that day was the most difficult decision of his life. He would not make the same mistake twice. He spent the autumn agitating, trying to rally the other dissenters. He found little support. Most were afraid. So he decided to act alone. On the morning of December 2nd, the SPD leadership, including Ebert Imber, cornered him. They begged, they reasoned, they threatened. Do not break ranks. They told him, "You will be a pariah." Liebknecht was unmoved. In the chamber, when the vote was called, he stood alone. His was the only "Nein" in a chamber of hundreds. A single voice against the roar of the war machine. He had prepared a written justification for his vote, a searing indictment of the war. He declared it was not a defensive war, but a preventative war launched by German and Austrian war parties in the obscurity of semi-absolutism and secret diplomacy. He called for an end to the war and a peace with no annexations. The president of the Reichstag, a conservative, refused to allow the statement to be read into the official record. It was a violation of parliamentary rules, but in wartime Germany, rules no longer mattered for dissenters. Undeterred, Liebknecht had copies of the declaration printed and illegally distributed. The reaction was immediate and vicious. The mainstream press branded him a traitor. The SPD party executive issued a public condemnation, stating he had broken discipline and damaged the party. His own comrades ostracized him. They would literally get up and walk away if he approached them in the Reichstag cafeteria. He became a political leper, but his lone vote was a symbol. It was a flare shot into the darkness, a signal to anti-war socialists across Germany and the world that resistance was possible. Rosa Luxemburg, his closest political partner, wrote to him with admiration. The Bolsheviks in Russia hailed his courage. To silence him, the German government took an extraordinary step. In February 1915, they conscripted the 43-year-old parliamentarian into the army. He had parliamentary immunity, but it was ignored. They didn't give him a rifle. They gave him a shovel and sent him to the Eastern Front to dig trenches, a humiliating assignment designed to break his spirit. He was forced to bury the dead, surrounded by the slaughter he was trying to stop. Karl Liebknecht's lone cry of "Nein" echoed far beyond the walls of the Reichstag. It was the beginning of a real, organized opposition. Liebknecht's defiance created a new reality. You could say, no, the taboo was broken. By the next vote on war credits, on March 20th, 1915, he was no longer alone. Another deputy, Otto Rühle, a radical teacher, joined him in voting no. 2 votes against, a tiny number, but it was double the previous one. More importantly, behind the scenes, a much larger group was forming. 30 SPD deputies now broke party discipline by leaving the chamber before the vote, a clear act of protest. They were not yet ready for open rebellion, but the party's pristine unity was visibly fracturing. The leadership, under Friedrich Ebert, doubled down. Dissent would be crushed. They used the party newspaper, Vorwärts or Forward, to attack the dissenters, accusing them of disloyalty and egotism. But as the war ground on, as the casualty lists grew longer and the food lines in the cities stretched for blocks, the opposition's arguments gained traction. The German people were suffering. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917, a period of near famine caused by the British naval blockade, pushed popular sentiment against the war. The dissenters began organizing in secret. They wrote and illegally distributed the Spartacus Brief, the Spartacus Letters, a series of pamphlets that gave a revolutionary analysis of the war. Rosa Luxemburg, from her prison cell, wrote her powerful critique, The Crisis of German Social Democracy, under the pseudonym Junius. It was smuggled out of jail page by page and became the intellectual cornerstone of the anti-war left. Hugo Hasse, the man who had read the first declaration, was now the undisputed leader of the growing internal opposition. The breaking point came on March 24th, 1916. The government was asking for an emergency budget. In the SPD caucus beforehand, the opposition had grown to 33 deputies. When the vote came to the Reichstag floor, Hasse rose to speak. It was an unprecedented breach of party discipline. He systematically dismantled the government's claim that it was a defensive war and condemned its policy of annexation. In response, the SPD majority did something unthinkable just 2 years prior. They passed a procedural motion to expel the entire group of dissenters from the party caucus. They were cast out. That very evening, the expelled deputies met in a restaurant and formed a new parliamentary group, the Social Democratic Working Group, or SAG. This was no longer just a few brave individuals. It was a formal, organized opposition bloc inside the German parliament. They had their own leadership, Haas and Georg Ledebour, their own press, and their own strategy. The SPD had officially split in two. This act, the expulsion of the Hasse-Ledebour group, was the point of no return. The leadership chose purity over unity, demanding absolute loyalty to the war effort. They had silenced the voices of dissent within their ranks, but in doing so, they had created an organized, legitimate opposition that would soon evolve into a rival party, one that would challenge their very claim to represent the German working class. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources like William A. Pelz's A People's History of Modern Europe, which connects the high-level political decisions to the sentiment on the street, and to specific biographies like the one on Rosa Luxemburg by John Peter Nettle, which provides detailed accounts of her correspondence and clandestine organizing from prison. Now back to the information. The formal split was now inevitable. For a year, the Social Democratic Working Group operated in a political no-man's land. They were still officially members of the SPD, but they had been kicked out of its parliamentary group. They were attacked by their old party and by the state. All across Germany, local SPD chapters were in turmoil. In places like Berlin, Leipzig, Bremen, and Düsseldorf, the local party organizations, closer to the war-weary working class, sided with the opposition. The national leadership responded with bureaucratic brutality, expelling entire city-level branches and seizing their assets and newspapers. The struggle for control of the party newspaper, Vorwärts, in Berlin was particularly bitter. When its editorial board became too critical of the war, the National Executive Committee used a compliant group of functionaries to physically take over the offices and fire the dissenting editors. The pressure cooker was about to explode. In April 1917, the rebels convened a conference in the city of Gotha. The choice of location was deeply symbolic. Gotha was where, in 1875, the two founding factions of German socialism had merged to form the original SPD. Now, it would be the site of its great divorce. From April 6th to the 8th, over 140 delegates, representing 91,000 party members who had been expelled or had resigned, gathered in a local hall to form a new party. They called themselves the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, the USPD. Hugo Haas was elected their chairman. The party was a broad church, united only by its fierce opposition to the war. It included reformist centrists like Eduard Bernstein, who had returned to a more radical position, Austro-Marxists like Karl Kautsky, and the revolutionary socialists of the Spartacus League, led by the imprisoned Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, who joined as an autonomous faction. Their founding declaration was a searing indictment of the old SPD, accusing them of becoming accomplices to the imperial government and betraying the international proletariat. The creation of the USPD was a seismic event in German politics. The anti-war movement now had a mass political vehicle. By 1918, its membership would swell to over 120,000. They had deputies in the Reichstag, growing support from disillusioned trade unionists, and a powerful base of workers and soldiers who were sick of the slaughter. The German state saw the USPD as a grave threat. Its members were spied on, its meetings broken up, its leaders harassed and arrested. The old SPD, the so-called majority socialists, now openly collaborated with the military authorities to suppress their former comrades, feeding them information and publicly denouncing them as enemies of the state, using the exact same language the Kaiser's regime had once used against all socialists. The split that began with one man's conscience had now cleaved the most powerful socialist movement in the world in two, ours, right in the middle of a world war. The final price for defiance was paid in blood. As the war dragged on, the USPD's position became more radical. The Russian Revolution in October 1917 showed that a workers' government was possible, inspiring millions. Inside the USPD, the Spartacus League, led by Liebknecht and Luxemburg, both of whom spent most of the war in prison, pushed for a similar socialist revolution in Germany. When the German war effort finally collapsed in the autumn of 1918, revolution erupted. It began with a sailors' mutiny in the port of Kiel at the end of October. They refused a suicidal final naval battle. The revolt spread like wildfire. Workers' and soldiers' councils, inspired by the Russian Soviets, sprang up in cities across the nation, taking power from the military authorities. On November 9, 1918, the revolution reached Berlin. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to Holland. In Berlin, two separate republics were declared. Philipp Scheidemann of the old SPD, desperate to preempt the radicals, declared a parliamentary republic from a balcony of the Reichstag. Just 2 hours later, from a balcony of the Berlin Palace, Karl Liebknecht, just released from prison a few weeks earlier, declared a free socialist republic. The two factions of the SPD were now in a direct, open struggle for the soul of the new Germany. Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the majority SPD, became chancellor. He hated the revolution. "I hate it like sin," he famously said. His goal was to contain it, to channel it into an orderly parliamentary democracy, and above all, to prevent a social revolution that would dispossess the capitalist class. To achieve this, on the night of November 10th, Ebert made a secret pact via a secure telephone line with General Wilhelm Groener, the new head of the German army. The army, the same institution that had propped up the Kaiser, would support the new government. In return, Ebert would use it to crush the far left. It was a deal with the devil. In January 1919, the Spartacists, now reformed as the Communist Party of Germany, launched an ill-planned uprising in Berlin. Ebert and his defense minister, Gustav Noske, another majority socialist, unleashed the Freikorps. These were right-wing, ultra-nationalist paramilitary units composed of demobilized, brutalized soldiers who hated socialists, Jews, and democracy. Noske famously declared, "Someone has to be the bloodhound. I won't shirk the responsibility." The Freikorps crushed the uprising with savage violence. On the evening of January 15, 1919, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were captured by Freikorps soldiers at a safe house in the Berlin district of Wilmersdorf. They were taken to the Eden Hotel, the Freikorps headquarters. There, they were tortured. Liebknecht was beaten with a rifle butt until he was semi-conscious, then driven to the Tiergarten Park and shot in the back of the head. His body was dumped at a nearby morgue under the name Unidentified Body. Rosa Luxemburg was beaten so severely with a rifle that her skull was fractured. She was shot in the head, and her body was thrown into the Landwehr Canal. It was not found until May 31st. Hugo Hasse, the first dissenter, survived longer. He became a respected member of the new Republic's parliament. On October 8, 1919, as he was walking up the steps of the Reichstag, he was shot by a mentally unstable nationalist. He died of his wounds a month later. The leaders of the anti-war faction, the men and women who had stood on principle against the slaughter of millions, were systematically murdered. With the direct or tacit approval of their former comrades in the SPD, the party that had once stood for international brotherhood became the instrument that killed the internationalists. Friedrich Ebert, the man who led the SPD's support for the war, became the first president of the Weimar Republic. Gustav Noske, who unleashed the Freikorps, earned his nickname the Bloodhound. The SPD leadership got their German Republic, but they built it on the bodies of their own brothers and sisters. For decades, the official story was that Liebknecht and Luxemburg were killed by rogue soldiers. But the truth was darker. Captain Waldemar Pabst, the Freikorps officer who ordered the murders, lived a long life, becoming a successful arms dealer. In 1962, he gave an interview to a German magazine, openly boasting about what he had done. He confirmed that before executing the two revolutionaries, he had telephoned Gustav Noske to secure government approval for his actions. The murders had been sanctioned at the highest levels. No one was ever seriously punished. The split in the German left, which began with a vote on war credits, created a chasm of hatred and mistrust that never healed. Throughout the Weimar years, communists and social democrats fought each other more fiercely than they fought the rising Nazi party. This division fatally weakened the Republic, making it easier for Hitler to seize power in 1933. The men who said yes to war credits eventually held power, but they lost their soul. The men who said no lost their lives, but their defiance became a legend, a brutal lesson in the cost of conscience, a ghost that haunts Germany to this day.